are we raising children in the best way possible? Now, this is something that, in part, Dr Ahmed, psychiatrist and author, certainly no stranger to this network, and I've done a bit of work with him at Sky over the years. This is something that he's looked at in a recent piece for the Institute of Public Affairs, but there was an extract of his essay in The Australian, and I read it with great interest the other day. Perhaps you did as well. One of the core questions that Tanvir begs us to at least consider is, are we doing enough to build up character in our young people? And I thought it's something we should discuss with him. He's on the line. Tanvir, good morning to you.
Great to be with you, Michael.
Yeah, nice to talk with you once again. Look, you always put forward, I think, very thought-provoking material, certainly concerning issues to do with our youth. There has been an enormous focus, obviously, during COVID on our young people and their mental capability and capacity to cope with all the change and disruption and everything which has obviously rocked their lives, arguably more than anybody else's. But at the core of what you ask here is, I think, very important. That goes to character. And as a society, you know, it takes a village to raise a child and all that sort of stuff. Are we instilling in our youth the right parameters to build up character to cope with the modern world?
Look, the very word character is really interesting, isn't it, Michael? Because the word raises a moral dimension. And one of the things I argue is that in recent decades, the way we view people has shifted away from the term character to personality. Now, some of that is good. Now, personality has a more clinical dimension, has less of a moral dimension. And look, some of that is reasonable, like, you know, especially things, you know, in a range of mental health disorders, addiction, and a host of areas. It's reasonable to see it in slightly less moral terms. But what that's changed is this notion of character. Let's think about the traits of character, where we think of, say, persistence, controlling impulses, being able to regulate your mood, controlling temper, a whole range of things, planning for the future. There's all these sort of sets of things that used to have this moral dimension, which meant that we placed a real emphasis at a societal family level. But increasingly, in my work, many of these things are medicalised, whether it's called ADHD or anxiety disorders. And again, there's a proportion of that absolutely they need help and medical treatment. Now, you referred to the pandemic. Now, one of the things the pandemic did, now it accelerated a host of trends, most notably, say, digitisation, but it also exposed the underbelly. Almost every society the pandemic went through, and it went through every society in the world, it exposed whatever weaknesses that were already kind of lurking and may not have kind of fully, you know, shown its face. And in our society, one of the things it showed was this youth mental health problem, which has been growing for at least a decade or two. Statistically, there's been a steady increase, and the pandemic really exposed it in a big way. And there's no question things like lockdowns affected young people more than other groups in many respects. So we saw an increase in, say, self-harm or anxiety presentations, etc. And what I'm arguing is there is a change for the modern generation, and that change is what I call novelty. There's almost a notion of, think of the term novelty in technical terms. What I mean by novelty is things like, over the last few hundred years, things like whether it's fatty food or obviously the internet. And, you know, if you go 100, 200 back years, it could be, say, even tabloid media. There's all these things that are now designed at a commercial level to co-opt our biological vulnerabilities. So whether that's for high-calorie food, but increasingly modern notion of social media, what that aims to co-opt is our need for status, connection, this kind of thing. So commercially, we get better and better at exploiting our biological vulnerabilities. And for this generation in particular, and for all of us, technology does it in a more sophisticated way than ever before.
And we've got these smartphones and all the rest of it. But, so, with all of that said, people will be saying, well, okay, how do we solve this? Now, in medical terms, it's often said, isn't it, that prevention is better than cure. But as you say, we turn to the medicine to cure the troubles that present themselves in our youth. But do we do enough to attempt to prevent these things popping up in the first place?
Well, I don't think we are. This is exactly what I'm arguing. And right, whether it's at a family level, look, not everyone's going to have a perfect family.
No.
But likewise in schools, I don't think we intentionally cultivate the notions of character that when we look at educational studies, say countries like Singapore, Japan, etc., Taiwan, they score much better. Now, I'm not saying that we all need to be hot-housed and tutoring. There are aspects of some of those countries that are just not going to be acceptable to our society. But I do think they much more intentionally cultivate these traits of what we used to think of character. And I'm not sure we do that nearly as well as we could. And to some extent, we emotionalize it. Even though we have very therapeutic sort of environments in schools, in some respects that may be, I guess coddling is a common word we use, but I don't think we're as firm, intentional, or as structured as we could be in cultivating these traits, because there's actually evidence that we actually can't change cognitive capacity. So what I mean by, we often talk about IQ. Once kids hit high school, we can't actually change their IQ, right? That their intelligence is largely set. What we can change is these things of character, what we call character. We can actually change that, and it's actually one of the biggest markers of inequality. So if we want a more equal, if we want a society where there's equal equality of opportunity, if we want a fairer, a better society, this is actually a key way. We often talk about redistributing income, and sure, there's a place for that, but we don't often think about redistributing these psychological skills or the traits of character.
So is it from that, are you saying that some of these problems present themselves in greater numbers in the lower socioeconomic communities more so than in the wealthy, or are there unique problems to both?
I think what you said there is true. I think there's unique problems to both. Like affluence can cover some of these traits, but there's no, poverty is often a marker of problems in impulse control. For example, just the mere fact of being able to save money is partly about being able to think of the future, control your immediate impulses. One of the great people in my field, Martin Seligman, he has a quote: "Poverty is a state of present-mindedness where you just can't focus on the future at all." And I think there's some truth in that. Now, affluence, one of the things I argue in this paper is our affluence is also touching on character traits.
Well, indeed, you say in a rich society, it can be harder to postpone immediate pleasures for the future.
And interestingly, but arguably, the rich are able to corrupt maybe is a strong word, but they can game some of the systems. So what I'm seeing now with many of my patients and in schools is they use this system of disability provisions. Now, that's overwhelmingly used in elite private schools.
So that's, for example, they're sitting the HSC or the end-of-year certificate, and they say, look, I need a bit more time to write the paper because of reason X or reason Y, and they get
exactly.
it. Yeah, okay.
Exactly. And part of that, they have better access to specialist mental health services, but also they're much more aware of, being able to, there's multiple pressures to achieve, to be high achieving, and even knowing about these things is much more prevalent in the middle classes. So we're getting an education and character divide, which I don't think there's much of a microscope on it, frankly.
Now, we've touched on a range of things here, and of course the role of the smartphone in all of this is a massive problem. But before we go, I just want to touch on one other thing that you've written, and we could talk for ages. Obviously, time won't permit us, but you say in your piece that the cushioning of vulnerable people that stable families and clans used to provide has largely been outsourced to the state. Not just that, but you also go on to say, as other sites of community and character formation have declined, schools have acquired more pressures to rectify the fragmentations. As you write, teachers become unofficial parents, particularly of children from broken families, especially in the lower socioeconomic areas. And, it is a genuine, I think, complaint from a lot of teachers that they are now being asked not just to teach curriculums, but also, in essence, to be de facto parents.
Yeah, absolutely. I think teachers now, what they're being asked to do is really difficult. And this is driving another divide. So a lot of parents move their kids from public schools because so much of the teacher's attention has to be on troubled kids. They have to be parents and behavioural experts. And increasingly, look at our broader economy, whether it's childcare, NDIS, all of these sort of things. They're all outsourcing of previous functions of the family. So we used to have clans and extended families, which, served various ends. I mean, all the growth in our economy, whether it's in the world of disability or a host of social services, aged care. Now, I'm not saying that the extended family can serve all these functions anymore, but a great deal of it is the outsourcing of the traditional functions of the family. I think we need to acknowledge that.
Fascinating to talk to you. Look, we'll talk again because there's a lot more to unpack in all of this, and if we go on forever, I think we'll just bamboozle. Well, you'll certainly bamboozle me and all our listeners. But if we do it in small doses, I think we'll all get our head around it. Fantastic to talk. I said we'll continue the conversation down the track. Tanveer, thank you.
Pleasure, Michael.
Most interesting. Tanveer Ahmed there, as I said, psychiatrist and author.